Good morning and welcome to Bible Light, bringing you Bible Light on today's pathway. This is Pastor Cordell Baker of the Independent Baptist Church speaking. Today we want to speak with you about 3 episodes in the life of Moses. But first, a message in song. Merle Booth sings Overshadowed.
Desolate my life would be, how dark and drear my nights and days, if Jesus' face I did not see, to brighten all its weary ways. Love eternal, changeless, pure, overshadowed by His mighty love. Rest is mine, serene, secure. He died to ransom me from sin. He lives to keep me day by day. I'm overshadowed by His mighty love, love that brightens all my way. Now judgment fears no more alarm. I dread not death nor Satan's power. The world for me has lost its charm. God's grace sustains me every hour. I'm overshadowed by His mighty love, love eternal, changeless, overshadowed by His mighty love. Rest is mine, serene,
And it came to pass in those days when Moses was grown, that he went out unto his brethren, and looked on their burdens. And he observed an Egyptian smiting an Hebrew of his brethren, one of his brethren. And he looked this way and that way, and when he saw that there was no man, he slew the Egyptian and hid him in the sand. Now, in doing this, Moses was openly identifying himself with this hated slave people and the God that they represented and served. And that in itself is a very remarkable thing. That was a good starting point. That was a good place to start. However, even in this very act, we find that Moses did something that we would not at all commend. In my notes, I have here spoken of Moses running without being sent. Now, it is entirely something that God wanted, I'm sure, that he identify himself with the true people of God. It was certainly something of God that he exercised faith in that true and living God. But in his first efforts to free these people, and that's what he was trying to do, Moses was like a runner who was running on a mission on which he had never been sent. And that's always a dangerous position to be in. You say, how do you know that he was running and had not been sent of God? Well, there are several things that tell me that. In the first place, we discover here that it was obviously premature. For it was 40 years later before God began to really move and prepare the groundwork for the removal of the people of Israel, and he did it in a most unmistakable manner. But secondly, we can see it in the very actions of Moses himself. We read here that when he went out, he observed an Egyptian smiting an Hebrew, one of his brethren, and he looked this way and that way, and when he saw that there was no man, he slew the Egyptian and hid him in the sand. What does this tell us here about Moses' act? Well, it tells us in the first place that even Moses himself was not sure of what he was doing. If a person is really sure that God is called and that God is directing a particular area of his life, there is no reason to look this way and that. You see the point I'm making? Moses was looking around to find out who was watching. And if God had really been in this thing and in the Moses taking charge and trying to deliver the children of Israel at this time, there would have been no need for that. It would not have made any difference who was looking. It wouldn't have made the slightest bit of difference who was watching. God himself would have been the one that was watching, and that was all that would really have been important. And so we find here that Moses was himself not real sure that God had yet called him to do this business of leading the children of Israel out. But secondly, we see that he took the matter totally into his own hands, and he did that which was totally illegal, unlawful in any society. He simply killed the Egyptian. Now, he had no right to do that. And this was not a thing, I'm sure, that at this point God had called him to do. Now, in warfare, there's something different. But God had not led for there to be any warfare yet between Israel and Egypt. It was not time for any of that sort of thing. And Moses was still under the laws of Egypt. In fact, he was actually acting as a magistrate for Egypt. So he was a man, in a sense, who was a messenger running without being sent. And yet we find here something very admirable about Moses. But that which is admirable is not always enough. And that is that Moses was moved by he was moved with sorrow over the burdens of these people. But Moses here went out and he saw the burdens of the people of Israel, and it moved him emotionally. Now, there's nothing wrong with that. It's really a sad day when any of us can really see the sorry plight of others and cannot be moved with compassion about it. And there's nothing wrong with that, but there is a whale of a lot of difference between being moved with a passion to relieve the social problems and burdens of others and being called of God for a particular task. There's a lot of difference between them. In our adult Bible class this morning, we discussed some of this very briefly, and I gave an illustration of how that when I was a senior in high school, they had what they called College and Career Day. And they brought in counselors from various colleges and universities, and then men who were prominent in the community in various pursuits of life to counsel with the senior students at the high school. And among others, they had a minister there. And I knew that he was a liberal minister. Even though I was just a high school student, I certainly knew the difference between them. And I had tangled enough already with this problem. And so out of curiosity, I went to his workshop just to find out what it was going to be all about. I already knew that God had called me into the ministry, and I was already preparing myself for it. But I thought I'd go and just see what this guy had to say. Well, it was very similar to what you'd have had if you'd have gone down the hall and had the Navy recruiter recruit you for the Navy. He tried to show all the advantages of being a minister. And of course, one of the greatest advantages was the usual idea that socially you could do something to lift the social structure of our country and of our people. And he put on quite an idealistic spiel along that line. The one thing that was totally missing in the whole thing was the idea that in the gospel ministry one enters with a call from God. There wasn't a word about that in it. And I don't wonder, for I'm quite certain that this particular fellow was one who ran without being sent. I do not think that God had ever called him into the ministry. In fact, he didn't even have a gospel ministry. He was the pastor of a large liberal church in the town, and I don't think that he knew a thing about the saving grace of the Lord Jesus Christ. But it's very easy for people to get stirred up and to see the opportunities of lifting others and to get excited about it. And that in itself is fine, but it's not enough for the thing that God wanted with Moses. And it's not enough for the person who would do a job for God simply to be moved by the burdens of the people. And so for that reason, we find that the whole thing failed. Moses was running, though he had not been sent. And as he faced the situation that was before him, he could see nothing to do except to use what we on the farm used to call main strength and awkwardness. You just go about it the way man goes about it. When we talked about doing things by main strength and awkwardness, we just simply meant that we got all the manpower, or as we now say it, all the beef we possibly could on a given job, and you push and you grunt and you groan and you do whatever's necessary to move whatever item it is that you got to move. That's all human strength, and that's what Moses was doing. Moses had gone out here and he had seen his people, and he was moved with compassion toward them, and that thus far it was fine. But he was acting totally in the flesh. God had not called him to do what he was now doing, and therefore he fell flat on his face. He looked this way and he looked that. And when one has to look this way and that to find out who's looking, you can be sure that he's not in the will of God. If we're in the will of God, there's no need for the looking this way and that to find out who's looking to see what we're doing. Now, notice in verses 15 to 22 that we find Moses running again. He's been running before as a messenger, but not one sent. And now he's running from the consequences of his fleshly efforts to try to do the work of God. And when he went out the second day, verse 13 says, behold, 2 men of the Hebrews strove together. And he said to him that did the wrong, wherefore smitest thou thy fellow? And he said, who made thee a prince and a judge over us? Intendest thou to kill me as thou didst kill the Egyptian? And Moses feared and said, surely this thing is known. Surely this thing is known. Notice here now that he goes out, and on the second day he finds 2 Hebrews. And he's going to try to stop this quarreling that's going on between them. He's saying to himself, this is not right. This is not the way brethren should be treating themselves. And I've got to stop this thing. And so Moses hurries up and he gets right in the middle of the thing, and I can almost see him walking up between the two and with his hands parting them from and stopping the blows that they were leveling at one another. And then he probably stood there and really dressed them down real good. Probably gave each one of them a good sound talking to. And notice the answer that he got. Who made thee a prince and a judge over us? Who gave you the authority to do anything to us anyway? Do you intend to kill me as you killed the Egyptian yesterday? And boy, I tell you, that thing went right through the heart of Moses. And notice what he said, surely this thing is known. Why was he concerned about that? Because he knew very well that what he had done the day before was not right. He knew very well that God had not directed him to kill that Egyptian the day before. And now he becomes real concerned. And he realizes that he's in a vulnerable condition and position. Notice the next verse. Now when Pharaoh heard this thing, he sought to slay Moses. And of course Moses in verse 14 knew that that was what was going to happen. But Moses fled from the face of Pharaoh and dwelt in the land of Midian and set him down by a well. Now if you go out and take your Bible map and trace out where Midian usually dwelt, of course you'll find it difficult to find borders to such a place because the Midianites were not a settled people. The Midianites were like the Bedouins of today who wander the deserts, feeding their flocks wherever they can find pasturage over a vast area. They live in tents, and so did the Midianites. And their total living is made by the pasturing of sheep, selling the products from the sheep, and so forth. It's a very meager living, although I suppose in some ways very enjoyable. Today they make some amount of comfort out of it. I have a prized picture in my collection of a Bedouin Arab's tent with a 30-foot television antenna sticking out the backside. And it's typical of the changes that are now taking place. But in those days, none of those things. They lived a very Spartan life. And the land of Midian, the area where Midian dwelt, was probably some of the poorest pasturage that there was available in the Middle East. And so here's Moses. He's fled to the land of Midian. And then he says he sat down by a well. Now the priest of Midian had 7 daughters, and they came and drew water and filled the troughs to water their father's flocks. And the shepherds, now these are some others from a different family or a different clan, the shepherds came and drove them away. Kind of cruel characters, weren't they? How would you like to have your daughters treated that way? Probably wouldn't, would you? Now the shepherds came and drove them away, but Moses stood up and helped them. Now you can't help but admire Moses. This is the third time actually, that he stood up for somebody else. He stood up for the Hebrew that was being beaten by the Egyptian. He stood up for the underdog of the 2 Hebrews that he found, fighting together. And now he stands up for the daughters of the priest of Midian. You can't help but admire his character in this respect. He's a guy that looks upon the underdog. He's a guy that looks upon the person who is having difficulty in life, and he is interested in helping. But again, this thing can be totally fleshly. And we have to really watch it. And so Moses stood up for them, and in doing so, he was introduced to the guy by the name of Reuel. And Reuel took him into his home. Moses became one of his shepherds, and there Moses gained his wife. But isn't this a tremendous change? Now, Moses before was a man who sat in the seat of the chariot. He was a man who from time to time probably sat on a throne. A man who walked down the street and people ran ahead and hollered at the populace saying, "Bow the knee." And now Moses is out in the backside of the desert feeding sheep. It's quite a come down, isn't it? Quite a come down. Yet we have to say this, that that's only from the standpoint of man. God knew what He was doing. It had not been the time for God to deliver the children of Israel, and for His servant, His servant was not yet trained and ready for that job. And one of the first things that Moses had to learn before God could ever use him was that his strength, his power, his influence was not enough to do the work of God. That's a hard lesson for any of us to learn. Very hard. But we have to learn it if we're ever going to be used of God in any way. His strength, His ideas even, His influence, His power, those things could not do the job. And there's only one way that God could teach this to Moses. It could not be done just by precept, and that was that Moses had to come down. And the guy who had once been great and mighty and a hero in Egypt had to come down to the place where he could be a mere shepherd and learn what life is all about from the standpoint of others. And here we find him there. From the standpoint of Moses, he's running from the consequences of his own sin. But God is now, even unbeknownst to Moses, using even that running as a means of preparing him for greater things to come. Now, as far as Moses was concerned, he was there only because he feared for his life. As far as God was concerned, this was going to be the beginning of greater things. Now, we're not going to go through chapter 3 and read all the passage that we looked at this morning. But there you find, of course, the angel of the Lord appearing to him, the flame of fire from out of the bush that burned and was not consumed. And we find the revelation that God gave of Himself. And we close this morning with verse 10, where God said, "Come now, therefore, and I will send you unto Pharaoh." And here we find the beginning of a third run that Moses is making. Now he is running from the call of God. Now it's only natural that this should happen. You see, Moses had once tried to deliver the children of Israel. He had fallen flat on his face. He had accomplished nothing. And now here he was, a shepherd, and he had been for some 40 years down there in the land of Midian. And it was a real come down. And Moses had learned his lesson well, only he had learned it too well now. I mean by that he had learned that his great power, that his position of great authority, and his ability to fight was not the thing that God was going to use to deliver the children of Israel. The problem now was that through these years, as Moses reflected back over it all, and had probably now become quite content with his lot as a shepherd in Midian, he had now gone clear over the opposite direction, and he looked on the whole thing as a hopeless cause and something that he could have nothing to do with. He had failed utterly. Why should he be expected to be one to go and deliver the children of Israel? "Come now, therefore, and I will send thee unto Pharaoh, that thou mayest bring forth my people, the children of Israel, out of Egypt." Now we're told in the intervening passage that the Pharaoh who was on the throne when Moses left Egypt had now died. But Moses didn't know that. There probably was no way that he could have known that. And God was now telling him, "Look, Moses, I'm going to send you back to that Pharaoh. You remember that Moses left Egypt because he was afraid of that very man. I'll send you back, that thou mayest bring forth my people. Moses, wasn't that what you wanted to do 40 years ago? Why, yes, that's what I wanted to do, but I failed. I couldn't do it. And I'm still the same man. And notice here in verse 11, the first of a series of objections. Who am I that I should go unto Pharaoh? Who am I? You see, Moses had learned his lesson, but he had learned it probably a little bit too well. Who am I? At this point, Moses is still thinking in the flesh. He's still thinking in the flesh. Who am I? That's a good question. If we're walking in the flesh, and we contemplated any aspect of the service of God, we might well ask that question, who am I? But notice God's answer in verse 12. And he said, certainly I will be with thee. I will be with thee. Now that changes the whole picture. You see, the problem 40 years ago was that God wasn't with him when he went to deliver the children of Israel. God wasn't with him then. But now he would be. And that makes all the difference in the world. I find it kind of interesting to see sometimes how God works in the lives of various people. I remember a young fellow whose parents for a brief time attended one of our congregations in Indiana. And actually, there were two fellows in the family, and both of them sensed the call of God into the gospel ministry. The strange thing about it, though, was that these guys came from the most tight-lipped family I ever saw in my life. Their dad was the kind of a guy where you could go into his living room, greet him, and sit down, and you could sit 15 minutes before he'd ever say a word. And he might sit another 15 minutes before he said another word. Nice guy, good farmer, a man that I'm sure sincerely loved the Lord, but boy, he was tight-lipped. And his boys were just like him. Not only that, but they even had somewhat of a stutter when they did talk. I tell you, they couldn't talk for sour apples. And God was calling them to preach. To be downright honest with you, I was a little skeptical of the whole deal. But you know what? They preached. They preached. And in fact, Virginia and I had a meeting in the church where one of these young men had served for several years just before we came back out west. Doing a great job serving the Lord. I didn't get a chance to meet his younger brother at that time, but I understand he's serving in even larger and more active church than that one. Doing a great job for God. Somehow God has an ability to just completely change people and do what's necessary. The real thing you see here is God with them. And Moses says, who am I? God says, I will be with thee. And if God says, I will be with thee, it really doesn't make any difference who I am, does it? If God is with us, it makes no difference who I am. And then a second objection, and mind you, this is all Moses running from God and from God's call. In verse 13, Moses said unto God, behold, when I come to the children of Israel, and shall say unto them, the God of your fathers hath sent me unto you, and they shall say to me, what is his name? What shall I say unto them? And very frankly, I think that Moses probably said that just about that way. What should I say unto them? I don't even know who you are. I don't even know anything about you. I don't know any theology. I don't know. I'm just completely ignorant. You want to send me? And God said unto him, I am that I am. What a tremendous revelation of the person of God you find in these next several verses. We don't have time to go into them in detail. We may come back to them some other time and deal with them. But God's answer, you'll notice, is sufficient. What shall I say? I am has sent you. That's enough. The self-existing one. And then look over into chapter 4. And Moses is still not done with his objections. He's still running. And Moses answered and said, but behold, they will not believe. They will not believe. You know, I think there probably aren't very many of us that work in the gospel work, whether as preachers or Sunday school workers. We work very long in Utah. We feel like saying that same thing, don't we? But they won't believe. And it's true. A great number of people won't believe. That's true. But it's also true that God knows who will believe, and He has some ways and means of persuasion. And I want you to notice what the answer was. The Lord said unto him, what is that in thine hand? This is verse 2. What is that in thine hand? Oh, just a simple little shepherd's rod. Just a stick cut out of a tree. God said, cast it down on the ground. He cast it down on the ground. It became a serpent. Moses was scared and ran from it. God said, now take it by the tail. Pick it up. Verse 6. Put forth thine hand. Verse 6 we have yet a second thing. I'm not going to go into all these, but the main point is this. What you got in your hand? I'm able to take that which is in your hand and use it. It doesn't have to be something big. It doesn't have to be something formidable. What's a simple little shepherd's rod against all the might of Egypt? Not much. But when God takes it and uses it, it becomes something different. What have you got in your hand? They will not believe. God has His ways. He'll take care of it. And then the final one of these, and with this we close, is in verse 10, the same chapter. And Moses said unto the Lord, O my Lord, I am not eloquent, neither heretofore nor since thou hast spoken unto thy servant, but I am slow of speech and of a slow tongue. And I'll bet he was by this time. He'd been 40 years where most of his time he spent, if he talked to anybody, he'd just talk to the sheep. Boy, that'd make you kind of slow of speech, wouldn't it? That'd make you slow of speech pretty quick. I was remarking about that farmer back in Indiana. You know, actually, that wasn't all that uncommon among many of the farm people that I knew. What did you have to do so much talking about when you're out riding the tractor all day? It didn't do you any good to talk to the tractor. And so some of these fellows get to the place where they're very private people. They don't talk a great deal. And I bet that was true with Moses. 40 years he'd been feeding sheep. It's not a very eloquent occupation. It doesn't involve a great deal of teaching. It doesn't involve a great deal of the things that would make for an eloquent person. I'm slow to speech. And the Lord said unto him, who made man's mouth? Good question, isn't it? Who made man's mouth? Well, it didn't take long for Moses to see that. And he had to realize that if God made our mouths to begin with, He's quite capable of filling it with His Word at the time when He wanted him to go. We don't have time to go ahead through the rest of the passage as God deals with Moses. But I wanted you to see tonight that Moses was just an ordinary man. And he went through some of the same kind of ups and downs that you and I come through. He ultimately came out victorious. He ultimately came to be one who really trusted in God and let God really use his life in a marvelous way. And for that, of course, he's to be commended. We ourselves need then to stop and realize that we too can be used of God. I would not suggest for a moment that we run without being sent. I would not suggest for a moment that we put ourselves in the place where because of fleshly service we have to run from the consequences of it. Neither would I suggest that we ought to run from God when He speaks to us and calls us into some area of His service. But I would say that we need to learn the same lessons that Moses learned out of this. Learn that God can take even the simplest person with the simplest equipment, and He can use them for His glory.
Face to face with Christ my Savior, face to face, what will it be? When with rapture I behold Him, Jesus Christ, who died for me. Face to face I shall behold Him, far beyond the starry sky. Face to face in all His glory, I shall see Him by and by.
We invite you to fellowship with us in our regular services at the Independent Baptist Church today. Sunday school is at 9:45, the morning worship service at 11, the evening gospel service at 6. Until this same time next week, this is Pastor Cordell Baker. I bid you goodbye, and I pray that God will bring you to a fullness of assurance of salvation in Jesus Christ.
Face to face I shall behold Him, far beyond the starry sky. Face to face in all His glory, I shall see Him by